Thank you for joining us this evening. We have a superb program for you with two experts with interesting and enlightening ideas to share with us tonight. I'm Roger Ream, president of the Fund for American Studies, and we're so thrilled to have alumni around the country joining us this evening. We've held several of these webinars for our New York City-based alumni, New York City area, and we've opened this up to alumni throughout the country. We think the topic is a really superb one, dealing with reinvigorating civic life in America, which is something I think we'd all agree is crucially important. Before I begin and introduce our two presenters, let me just briefly tell you that things are going very well at the Fund for American Studies. We did a great transition this past May to virtual programs at both in Washington, D.C. and with our high school programs, had students from around the world taking part in our courses and virtual internships, and barely missed a beat in converting and engaging students in this program. Also, I wanted to mention that for those of you alumni who haven't joined our alumni portal, please do. It's an easy address to remember, www.alumni.tfas.org. And if you need help, Michelle at tfas.org can help you. It's a great way to find old friends from your program, to network with alumni in your area who went to your school or in your career field. It's been a ongoing priority of ours to re-engage alumni, engage alumni in activities throughout the world. We had alumni getting elected to office across the country in the elections of 2 weeks ago. We have alumni moving up in positions in all fields of endeavor in our country and throughout the world. So it's really exciting time to get engaged in alumni activities. Well, tonight, our topic is reinvigorating civic life in America, which is, I think, a very fitting topic for TFAS. For more than 50 years now, we've tried to create an environment in our classrooms and in our programs for civil discussion, for engagement, for motivating students to be involved in the life of their communities and the nation. We really try to promote intellectual curiosity and the search for truth in our programs, and spark that interest in being engaged citizens when they finish our programs. So tonight we're going to hear from both Alexandra Hudson and Professor Richard Boyd, two of my very favorite people. Alexandra has been a recent alum of our Robert Novak Journalism Fellows program. She was a unanimous pick of our judges for a fellowship with her work on civility and civil society. She lives with her husband and her relatively young newborn, almost son, in Indianapolis, Indiana. She escaped the swamp a few years ago and went out to Indiana, where people are engaged in civic life in ways you don't see here in Washington. She is a full-time writer and speaker. Her works appeared in USA Today and many other publications, and she'll have a book coming out soon on this topic of civil discourse and civility, published by St. Martin's Press. So we're very proud of that accomplishment. After Alexandra makes some opening remarks, we'll hear from Professor Richard Boyd, Associate Professor of Government at Georgetown University, and a longtime professor in our DC programs, both the summer programs, the fall and spring semester, and in other shorter programs we hold. He's published, more than 30 journal articles, written about thinkers such as Aristotle, Locke, David Hume, Adam Smith, James Madison, Edmund Burke, Tocqueville, and many others. He is the author of Uncivil Society, The Perils of Pluralism and the Making of Modern Liberalism, which was published by Lexington, Ronan, and Littlefield in 2004. He's also editor of Tocqueville and The Frontiers of Democracy, published by Cambridge. So two great people. I know you'll enjoy what they have to say. I'll go to Lexi first, Alexandra Hudson, to make her remarks, and then you'll hear from Richard. So it's all yours.
Thank you so much to all of you, and thanks to TFAS for having me. I've loved my year as a Novak Fellow and really thrilled to be here.
Thank you.
In 176 AD, Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, known to history as the Philosopher King, endowed 4 chairs of philosophy in the city of Athens. For the Epicureans, he endowed the garden. For the Platonists, the academy. The Aristotelians, the Lyceum. And for the Stoics, he endowed the porch, or the Stoa Poikol, which was located at the ancient Agora in Athens, and of course, which has been home to many of these famous philosophical schools for years. Marcus Aurelius, as well as his intellectual mentor, Epictetus, were Stoics, and also among history's greatest advocates for human freedom and flourishing. Their legacies have lessons that can instruct us today as we contemplate the question at hand this evening. How can we revive American civic life? The Stoic porch represented an important idea. The capacity for true freedom and flourishing is within each of us and can be realized when each of us choose to distinguish between what we can control and what we can't. We must also make the best out of what is within our control. Both men had some authority on this topic. Epictetus's life was very limiting. He was a slave. He called himself a cripple. And so he didn't have the physical and political freedoms that many of us enjoy. But he accepted his circumstances that were in his control, and he made the most out of his situation, going on to be one of the most important philosophers in history. He did not have time for those who sat around and purported high-minded ideals, but didn't live up to them in their every day, as he himself strove to do. Marcus Aurelius was a Roman emperor during a time of constant war and plague, yet also endeavored to focus only on what he could control, to treat those around him justly, and to live a life of personal virtue. It's easy to look around us at the divided state of our world and to blame our public leaders, the media, our education system, a pathogen, and so much more. But that's not a terribly useful way to spend our time. Instead, the Stoic porch of Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus have both a literal and a metaphorical significance to the question of how to renew American civic life. First, the literal significance. Roger alluded to my time at the U.S. Department of Education that was incredibly disillusioning for me. I left my year of government in January of 2018, and I presumed that all of America was as broken and fragmented and divided and polarized as my experience in government had been. But my husband and I moved to Indianapolis in April of 2018 and realized that that could not be farther from the truth. I remember the day that I met Joanna Taft. She approached us after church one day and introduced herself and said, "Would you like to come porch with us?" Her and her husband. And that invitation really did transform our experience in Indianapolis. I realized that Joanna is a serial builder of social capital, a term that social scientists use, as we all know, to describe the currency of human relationships. But she didn't just accrue that currency. She spent it as quickly as she earned it, creating new institutions, forming relationships, and making her community better. I quickly came to realize that all good things in Indianapolis had her fingerprints on them. She started a Christian classical school called the Oaks Academy that is now ranked, 20 years ago, it is now ranked one of the best in the States and was just profiled in Ann Snyder Brooks's book on character and institutions that form robust character. She helped start Heron High School, which is a charter school that seeks to build a new generation of well-rounded citizens and art patrons. And she started the Harrison Center, which is an art gallery and center that cultivates artistic talent in Indianapolis in the hopes of beautifying the community. And of course, she porches, which has become in Indianapolis a quasi-institution in and of itself. I realized that for Joanna, the porch is her communal living room. It's a space where she builds new relationships. But her Stoya Pokal, her porch, is also an incubator of new ideas and a place where new institutions begin that help make the community better, freer, and flourish. Second, the metaphorical significance. During my time as a Novak Fellow this past year, I took the chance in pre-pandemic times to travel the country and study the lives of modern day Stoic porchers who, like Joanna, are transforming their country and reviving our civil society by improving their communities, one relationship at a time. Not only is this something that everyone can do, though it is that, but it is also among the best things that anyone can do to revive our culture and our civic life. Therein lays our answer to this question of American civic renewal. I'd like you to consider a few questions. First, what are the porches in your life? If not the literal porch, then where is a space that you can welcome people into your life, just as Joanna did? It could be a front yard, a stoop, a public park, or a bench. But a public living room of sorts to meet and convene and build friendships and trust, all of which are essential to the survival of our democracy, our political institutions, and our civil society. Second, how can you cultivate a disposition of Stoic porching, one that strives to make meaningful human connections anywhere, anytime, wherever you can in your everyday? One that is actively seeking to show hospitality to the stranger, to reach across the cultural or political divide, and to build the civic friendship and foster the basic respect necessary for a truly civilized society and for American civic renewal. Of course, the pandemic complicates both of these things, but God willing, we will have a vaccine soon. And we don't want to be out of the habit of looking for opportunities to connect with our fellow citizens and renew our civic life. By taking away a lot of these opportunities, in fact, the pandemic has reminded us of how important they are. During the pandemic, it's easy to feel stuck in our houses and helpless as we scroll through the national headlines, which are often negative and frustrating, and it's often easy to feel like there's nothing we can do. But Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus remind us that focusing on what we cannot do is not the answer. Because the truth is, we can do a lot. It begins with each of us choosing to follow the footsteps of the philosopher king and his teacher Epictetus, with each of us renewing American civil society from the bottom up in our everyday and from our front porches. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. That was fascinating. And now we will go to Professor Richard Boyd.
Great, thank you, Roger. And it's a real pleasure to be here tonight. Thanks to all of you who've taken the time to join us. So I guess as an intellectual historian, my comments tonight may be less prescriptive, less in the way of concrete things to do, and more in the way of different ways of thinking about civic life in America at this particular juncture. So in putting together my comments for tonight, I started worrying that not only do I have nothing particularly original to say about what's transpired over the past few weeks or months or years in America, but like many Americans, I really do worry that I'm succumbing to a kind of political fatigue, right? As recently as 6 or 7 years ago, we political scientists were determined to try to find better ways of getting people more excited about politics and thinking more about politics. And now I'm almost tempted, not quite, but almost tempted to think that we might want to encourage people to think less about politics. Now, I wouldn't quite go that far, but what I want to try to do tonight is to maybe do something a little bit different and share with you a little historical vignette about a time and a person all but forgotten in American history, and then step back and suggest how this might actually be a hopeful omen for present times. Not any concrete prescriptions, but something that should give us hope and should be an encouragement. I'm of the school of thought that we should look to history not just to learn its lessons, but or avoid its mistakes, but also to put our contemporary situation in perspective. On this issue of historical perspective, so one of the things that I think we confront on a day-to-day basis is this lament about partisanship in America. And we tend to think that this partisanship is a relatively recent phenomenon, that it's only in 2016 or in the Trump era or of late that we are partisan and divided. But for my money, the Federalist era, running from roughly 1788 to 1800 or so, was even more bitterly partisan, deeply ideologically divided, uncivil, and even racked by public violence. Any of you who did American political thought with me know that I think this is really a decisive era in American politics, when a lot of our institutions came into being in the form that we know them today, and especially when our two-party system took shape. The period, of course, roughly spans the presidencies of George Washington and John Adams, they're the Federalist presidents for whom the era is named, and then their opposition in the form of the Democratic Republicans, the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans. The flashpoint of this partisanship and a source of a lot of the acrimony was John Jay's treaty in 1795, which was widely regarded as being betrayal of America by elites to our sworn enemy, Britain. As you know, Jay worked this treaty out with the British, a nation we just fought a war to emancipate ourselves from. He essentially threw our allies, France, under the bus, and people were angry. People were hot about this. In response, cities like Boston and Philadelphia were virtually shut down by violence, not even mostly peaceful protesting, overt violence. Angry mobs descended on the president's house in Philadelphia, and Washington reportedly had to flee town. So these attacks on Jay and Washington and other Federalist elites in the media were instigated by the press at the time, the media, the partisan newspapers and broadsides. And amongst the most polemical of these social influencers of the day was a fellow I want to just talk a little bit about in my comments today. A figure, again, obscure. I'd be shocked if anyone has ever heard of him, but a figure named Colonel Matthew Lyon, Lyon, who lived from about 1749 to 1822, known as the madman from the mountain, because he was the member of Congress from Vermont, or the spittin' Irishman. More on that in a second. He was somebody who's Irish by birth, was sent to America as a conscripted laborer, served in the Revolutionary Era Army, and then was eventually elected to Congress from Vermont as a Jeffersonian Democratic Republican. To say he was a controversial or even uncivil figure in his own day is an understatement. When he's inaugurated into Congress, there's already a ceremony whereby Congress is supposed to go en masse to meet the president and be received by President Adams. And Lyon says, "I'm not doing that. I'm not going to bow down in front of this aristocrat." This was regarded as being a huge scandal, a huge uncivil act on his part. When the Federalists tried to shame him, Lyon responded with a stream of invectives, calling them descendants of New England witch hunters and the bastard children of Oliver Cromwell. And then he told them to kiss a four-letter word of the time to describe his rear end. So not a particularly civil figure, a very polarizing figure. But of all of his incivilities, he's best remembered for what was known as his courteous retort to Roger Griswold, who was a very wealthy elite Federalist member of Congress from Connecticut. As the story goes, Griswold came up to him and said something that was insulting to him, and rather than respond, Lyon simply spat in his face. It didn't happen that day, but later on, the two of them brawled on the floors of Congress. Apparently, Griswold came up behind Lyon with a club, a stick, and was beating him on the head. And Lyon found somewhere some tongs in a fireplace, and the two of them were going at it like gladiators on the floor of Congress, cheered on by the two parties. And only once the weapons are taken away from them were the two able to be separated. Lyon then went on another PS to the story. He was then had the honor of being the first person thrown in prison under the Alien Sedition Act and convicted of sedition for things that he published attacking John Adams. And then just one other little interesting footnote about him. He had the historical significance of being the one to cast the decisive vote in Congress in the 1800 election. Very, very deeply contested election. There was no candidate who emerged from Electoral College with a majority. And so Congress was called upon to settle this. And it was Lyon who cast the vote that made Thomas Jefferson president and literally put an end to the Federalist era. So anyway, a fascinating character, utterly forgotten, and yet quite polarizing and quite controversial in his own day. So why is this of interest to anyone other than intellectual historians? Or what can the story about this rancor and partisanship and this deep ideological divide from then tell us about the prospects for civic renewal in our own society? I guess the thing that we're most concerned about today. Well, first, I think it's important to keep in mind that what we regard today as being unprecedented, this deep divide or this incivility or this partisanship, is not at all unprecedented in American history. And while I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's worse now or better now, certainly the 1790s, the 1860s, even the 1960s were all highly polarized and highly contentious. And yet, contrary to the fears of many critics, the United States has emerged from these periods strengthened and rejuvenated in different ways, not rather torn completely and irreparably asunder. So I think there's reason to look at instances like this as being hopeful rather than being causes for skepticism. Secondly, we're talking about institutions back in the period I've just described that were relatively new and thus relatively fragile. Now we have the benefit of institutions that have abided for over 200 years, that are much more deeply entrenched and deeply respected and taken for granted. This hallowed tradition that Lyon scandalized everybody for violating was like 5 years old at the time, right? Whereas we have hundreds of years of traditions and institutions. And so one would hope at least that that makes them in some way much more resilient. Thirdly, we should remember that public opinion changes and national wounds heal. In the little vignette that I just told about the controversies over the Jay Treaty, public opinion shifts relatively quickly on this issue. The French demonstrate that maybe they're not as trustworthy or friendly as we thought that they were. Washington, who was reviled and criticized for having signed this treaty, emerges from his second presidency as someone who is credited for demonstrating statesmanship. And then later on, the PS of all this, Lyon, he leaves Vermont, moves to Kentucky, is reelected to Congress later on, and later on at a very significant point later in his life, he ends up voting with the Federalists on an issue of tariffs, right? His sworn enemies, they find some common ground later on different issues. So things change and wounds heal. And then lastly, I think it's important to keep in mind that civic life is very often set not at the margins, but at the center, right? In his age and in our age, one would like to think that the vast majority of politicians and the vast majority of citizens are indeed civil, are indeed respectful of one another, are not the kinds of people engaging in these sorts of polarizing behaviors. And yet, of course, the focus, the drama is always on the edges, on the margins, on figures like Lyon. So in conclusion, I guess, I have no concrete prescriptions other than I would say that the lesson of this might be that even in what might seem like a very dark time, an era of partisan rancor, it's important to keep things in perspective and recognize that today's uncivil conflicts might very well be, at least we'd hope that they will be, grounds for civic renewal and civic engagement in the future. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, both to Alexandra and to Richard. A very interesting contrast in your remarks. One could summarize them as saying, Alexandra gave us hope that civility is coming back, and Richard said it doesn't matter, we can be incivil and the republic will survive. Not quite, I'm joking. But first of all, let me say, if you have questions for either speaker or both, put them in the chat. My colleague Xander Archuleta was monitoring that, and he will pose the questions. I was just, what came to mind as both of you spoke was that, when Richard said he made the comment at the beginning of your remarks, Richard, about thinking less about politics and political activity, which I think is a great message. I think too many of us get so wrapped up in politics That's particularly true, of course, for those of us who live in the Washington, D.C. area. I know maybe less so in other parts of the country, but still you see it. I was heartened to see a piece in the paper a few weeks ago in the Wall Street Journal, I think, where it profiled two neighbors, families who live next door to each other, one with Biden-Harris signs, the other with Trump-Pence signs in their yard. But they also had signs that pointed to each other's yard saying, "We still love them," and "We still love them." And I thought that's healthy. You know, we have different politics perhaps, but we love our neighbors. I've heard that before. So let me ask, maybe I'll pose this to Lexi first at least, and Richard can comment if he want, but is there a problem today that politics has become all too consuming in our lives, and that unless we can push it aside a little or reduce kind of government's involvement and become more of a bottom-up society, we won't have the kind of civility we're aiming for?
I think that's a lovely question, and I love what Richard said about the fact that politics has become too much of our public consciousness. I absolutely agree, and there are two things I want to say on that. The first is that arguably we are there are many metrics that show we are a less religious society. We're a less communal society. We're very, very transient, especially younger generations. We migrate, tumbleweeds, as my father would say. And so without these traditional touchstones, these things that would moor us to values and to orient us, arguably politics has filled that vacuum. It's become our religion. It's become our community. And that has contributed to our the tribal nature of our politics, and the fervor. It's difficult to talk politics with some people, or even I find it frustrating to watch any sort of cable news, talk television, because it's just like a quasi-religious fervor that you're not going to argue or rationalize and anyone away from their precepts. And so that's one thing I wanted to say that I think is noteworthy, that our demographics, our habits, our culture has changed, that and it could be said that politics has taken the place that community and that religion once had in our lives. So that's one thing. The second thing I wanted to mention was a historical precedent that showed the potential uses of talking about not politics and reviving our civic life. So my view on civility is that it's a person-to-person virtue. It's something that happens between people. It has communicative value. It has trust-building value. All these, plethora of positive externalities. I say it's in my work. It's both an inherent and an instrumental good. It's something that it's worth treating people with dignity and respect. Inherently, that's just objectively a good thing, but it's also instrumentally good because it allows us to coexist amid deep difference and to get along with people that we don't necessarily like very much. So I have been the last week or so up to my eyeballs in some C-SPAN archives. I have been watching some C-SPAN footage from the late 90s, where there were a series of these civility summits that Congress, it was actually, so the Pew Charitable Trust put up about $700,000, and the Aspen Institute ran a number of these events. And I was so fascinated to listen to the dialogue. The first one was in 1997, and you can listen, this is all like freely available. You can listen to the footage before the first Civility Summit, and after the first Civility Summit, and then before a second one later. And it's a really interesting trajectory. So before their Civility Summit, it was really high-minded and, in my opinion, incredibly realistic goals. Congresspersons, men and women who were there, said, we're not going to diminish our differences. We're going to try and figure out how to live with these differences and just kind of work together again. Because we think it was bad today. It's funny to think that in 97, they thought it was so bad they needed like take all the people of Congress to Pennsylvania, to Hershey, Pennsylvania, where this existed. Second, I thought it was really interesting. They had people's families there, like spouses and kids. 200 congresspersons went, and 180 spouses, and like over 100 kids. And after the conference, like Newt Gingrich and all of the congresspersons that were in leadership that were there said it was just the most wonderful thing. We were reminded that we have much more in common than we have not in common, because we're parents, you know, we're spouses, and the spouses were incredibly useful and kind of tempering partisan passions. So all that to say, like before and after, like seemed like an incredible success, because why? People were reminded that politics is not the most important thing. We're humans first, we're citizens first. We're all just trying to, you know, serve our constituents. We have wives and kids, and trust was rebuilt. Then what happens right after that? The Clinton impeachment. And that's kind of like the test of civility. Like, it's easy to be civil and decent when there's no pressure, but the mystic chords of affection were really strained during that during the Clinton impeachment. And there was so much so that Pew and Aspen wanted to have another civility summit, and the Democratic leadership, I forget his name off the top of my head, but he was booed off stage when he even mentioned it by his fellow Democrats. They're like, absolutely not. We're not going to go to Hershey, Pennsylvania with those ridiculous Republicans. And so that's not to disparage Democrats at all. It's just to say, like, I think a few things are interesting. One, there are measurable gains to be had, I think, by reminding us what we have in common as citizens, as humans, as people, and that needs to be front of mind constantly. But that is not a foregone conclusion. The test of that, the test of civility is how we treat people when we don't agree with them and when we have nothing to benefit from being decent and kind to those that we differ from. And so I love what Richard said, that there are lessons in history. We can learn from the mistakes and also gain perspective on our own time. And I love history. I'm a lifelong lover and student of history, but I like to say history is both caution and comfort. You know, like we can learn from the mistakes of the past, and we can it can instruct us into our own moment, but it's also comforting as well to know that, you know, human nature doesn't really change that much. We've been here before, we've managed, and maybe we can do it again, and kind of incorporate those lessons learned.
Yeah. By the way, Richard, while you were speaking, Alexandra posted in chat, or Q&A maybe, a picture of the
Wonderful. I saw that.
Congress. Okay. Yeah.
Yes. And I hope I wasn't able to click on the link yet, but there's a wonderful illustration, a cartoon of the two of them battling it out on the floors of Congress. So I hope that's linked there as well.
Yeah.
I didn't know how to put that on the screen and share it without cluttering things up, but it gives you some flavor for the drama that was involved in all that. If I could just quickly maybe add two things, or add two quick distinctions to what Alexandra said, and maybe also in response to your reaction, Roger. So I think I can see why you might think that maybe the spirit or the implication of my comments might be different than Alexandra's, but I think there's actually some area of agreement between the two of us. And maybe it comes down to the distinction between political engagement and civic engagement. Because one of the things I really liked about Alexandra's was that it was a suggestion that the real source of civic renewal is not perhaps going to come through politics or through formal political institutions, or for people voting or getting, spending all their time watching Fox News or C-SPAN. It's going to come from people being engaged in communities, right? The porchness, right? The porch effect that she's describing there. And so I'm all for civic engagement, and I'm all for porches. I'm just a little bit, I think that we've gone too far in the direction of politics. And when porches become political, then I think there's the real danger or worry that they cease to be the kind of places where we welcome others, and they become the kind of things that separate us. Politics separates us. It bonds people, but what we need are things that bridge. And I think civic life is bridging rather than bonding. And then the other thing that comes up on this issue of civility, and I think it's kind of something I've always found helpful for trying to gesture in the direction of what a healthy civic discourse would look like. There's the concept that Michael Oakeshott has of civility as being adverbial, right? That it may ultimately, I mean, there's certain things that I think one cannot say in a way that's polite or respectful. And yet so much of how we interact with one another in public life is not so much or not exclusively a matter of what we want to say, or as Steve asked, that we might disagree with our neighbors about how we would elect a candidate or what policies we'd endorse, but it really hinges on how we say it. Do we say something respectfully, politely, openly, even lovingly? The manner in which one says something, I think, matters, and sometimes even matters more than the substance of what it is that we disagree about. So I would just add that as a sort of friendly. I guess that's also really implicit in what Alexandra said as well. So I just two distinctions, right, that might be helpful in trying to point in the direction that would be more concrete. Yeah. So
I love that. Can I offer a few thoughts, Roger, in response?
Yeah, before you
Okay.
do,
Yeah.
let me just ask Xander, can everyone read the questions being posted in Q&A, or can only you?
It's just visible to us.
Well,
So
the reason I asked that is Richard referred to a question from Steve. So maybe before Alexander responds, you want to pose Steve's question so everyone knows what it is, and then we'll let Alexander respond too, because Richard gave a good response there. Did you see a question posted by Steve?
yeah, in the chat.
Yeah.
If we have friends and neighbors who we know disagree with us, should we engage them and risk discord? Or is it better to keep our thoughts to ourselves and keep the peace?
Now, Alexander, you don't have to respond to that specific question because Richard did very well, but go ahead and offer your comments.
I'm sorry, I missed Richard even responding to that, but that's a great question. I guess I didn't realize that's what he was responding to. It's a wonderful question. So one implicit answer to that ties into something I wanted to say, you know, on Joanna's porch and in kind of the porchy ethos, like key is talking not politics. You know, politics is perfectly plausible, but building the trust by talking about not politics, you know, talking about movies, talking about like apolitical things that, again, getting back to reminding us that we have more in common than not. That was something that I think is noteworthy. Second, you mentioned, Richard, the difference between political and civic engagement. You're absolutely right that those things are often conflated when we're talking about all things civics. And even when you type it, when you type in, like I read a lot about civility and democracy, and here's this book I'm reading right now called Can We Talk? It's by 14 essays by prominent political scientists, and they're all about voting and about political partisanship, and it's all like very high level macro stuff. And what doesn't help is that a lot of the texts and books and ideas that have permeated our public consciousness group them all in together. And what I'm thinking of is Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, where when he's talking about American civic life, he throws it all together. Civility, voting, giving, like donations, volunteering. And so I think you're right, like we lack kind of a vocabulary and a conceptual a framework to distinguish these different gradations and manifestations of civic life and civility, because and that's what my book, what I hope to do in my book, to bring some kind of etymological and conceptual clarity to that. So I agree with you there. And then last thing, I love what Richard said about Oakeshott, as civility is adverbial. Like an additional frustration with civility, like it doesn't fit clearly into either our cardinal virtues of temperance and prudence, nor our traditional like democratic virtues of the rule of law, justice, and equality. And so it kind of gets like all muddled together and people it's kind of like a Rorschach test. People like draw out of it or hate on it, whatever they want. So anyway, just some observations responding to Richard's great point. And thanks, Steve, for that great question.
Now we'll let Xander try to get through. I'll just ask you both to try to keep your answers brief, because it looks like we've had a lot of questions posted. So I'd like to get through as many as we can in our remaining time. So fire away, Xander.
I have a question from Dylan Reed. Recognizing all the points made, my general concern right now is that trust in institutions are at an all-time low. Look at churches, schools, police, or government. People don't trust them. So what are your thoughts on the role of institutions overall that can help build strong communities and service?
Richard, do you want to take that one? That easy. question?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess there's an empirical part of it, and then there is a policy part of it. I guess the empirical premise is one. I guess I don't know the statistics, or I guess it's difficult to measure, but I kind of concur that in terms of trust in institutions, that I don't know if it's an all-time low, but it's certainly low, right? One would like to think that we have more trust in our institutions than we do have right now. Or one would like to see that. I guess, I mean, part of it, it's two-way, isn't it, right? That in order for someone to trust a person or to trust an institution, that institution or that person has to demonstrate themselves as being trustworthy. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know exactly how institutions in an environment where, a political environment where people are in the business or people are scoring points by virtue of denigrating certain institutions or casting doubt on certain institutions, it seems like that has become an adaptive behavior in our political system. And then once that starts, it's not clear how it is that institutions can respond, I guess by trying to, when someone says, hey, you know, that institution is corrupt, or hey, there's cheating over here, that it's important to step back and try to think about whether there's empirical evidence for that. Or it's important for the institution perhaps to conduct itself in such a way that makes it look beyond reproach, right? I mean, I think it goes two ways, right? If you can have people who are throwing mud on institutions, and that's on the people who are throwing mud, you want to try to wipe the mud off, but then there's some things that institutions seem to have been doing, whether it's Congress, whether it's the presidency, whether it's other public institutions, whether it's churches and other things, that lend themselves to creating uncertainty, and that maybe have in their own way been responsible for undermining the trust from within. So I wish I could come up with a list of 7 things, right, that we can do to restore this trust. But trust is a complicated thing. It's like a personal relationship. We have people in our lives where they do things, and then do you trust them anymore? And then they behave well for a while. It's a very, very complicated psychological and sociological dynamic. So again, I agree with the premise of the question, but I'm not sure that I have a pinpoint answer to it.
Xander,
Thanks
another
so
one?
much, Richard. Our next question is directed to Alexandra. What tips or advice do you have for a smooth reconnection with people after a vaccine is introduced? It's so stressful to think that we might all of a sudden go back to in-person connections. I feel like I've forgotten so much about the etiquette of in-person networking. That comes from Salma Khalif.
Wow, that's a good one for you, Alexandra.
It's a great one. It's so true that socialization is a habit. And if we just don't see people like we normally do, we just forget things. Like, we had a friend over for dinner on our porch, and I forgot the table napkins, you know, like I'm like, oh, yeah, right. You eat with napkins. Or like, we had my husband's boss over for dinner. And I said something that was like just totally blunt that I normally would have like filtered or tempered. I actually can't remember what it was. and it just caught me off guard, where I was like, oh my word, like, I'm just so used to being unfiltered, and like that I'm just talking to my husband most of the time. So it's really true. I mean, I think the best thing to do is like trial by error. Like, we're kind of starting from scratch a little bit, in the same way that we were socialized in kindergarten. Like, when we went from just knowing our family first and foremost, to like being out in the world, you make mistakes, and you show and people will make mistakes and offend you and say weird things, and just, you know, extend grace on grace on grace, and just hope that we kind of acclimate. Again, it'll be very, I think there will be a whole genre of kind of like post-COVID social faux pas that I think will be really fun to watch. But just do it, and don't let fear of making a mistake and fear of rejection, don't let that hold you back from like making the bid and making the connection.
Unfortunately, we aren't doing that socializing in kindergarten anymore either, so I worry about
Right.
the future.
Right.
Our next question comes from Francisca Contreras Strange. She says, once a judge I worked for told me that the physical reaction or response, such as violence, that some people might have shows that society is at least alive, and that perhaps they just don't know how to use their voice. Could each of the panelists please give me their opinion on this?
Can I maybe take a shot at that?
Yeah. Need it, repeat it. Go ahead.
I think within limits, I somewhat agree with that principle. I hate to always take something back to some other political theorist or some other social theorist, but sometimes they write about these issues and they thought about them better than I, so I'm just going to piggyback on their ideas. But that idea reminds me very much of the German sociologist George Simmel. Simmel. And this was one of Zimmel's points about what was actually healthy about conflict. That rather than conflict, if you look at, say, I don't know, a family or a marriage or a society, and you see no conflict, then that's either a society that could be actually evidence of a lack of healthiness on the part of the organic entity, the organic sociological entity. That a conflict can actually be a sign of the strength and resilience of the organism. That people within a family, say, or people within an institution care enough about it that they are willing to exercise their voice, or maybe they're able to. Sometimes they're willing to even use a bit of actual conflict, a bit of aggression. But that demonstrates at least that they care, as opposed to utter and complete apathy or utter and complete withdrawal or utter and complete indifference, which is, I think, the real danger, or the real worry we have to have in society. So I mean, it's a balancing matter. And I don't know that you can say conflict is always, or aggression is always categorically good, or it's always categorically bad. But I think it can be a sign of a certain kind of civic health, that citizens still care enough to object, or to stand up, or to assert themselves, or maybe sometimes even to break a few things, right? That demonstrates at least some buy-in to the system. So I guess I kind of agree with that, although I think there are limits. Like with everything else, there are limits. If politics becomes nothing more than violence, then there's no room for deliberation, and that's not a healthy symptom either.
Thank you much, Richard. Our next question comes from an attendee who says, do you think the time of COVID has increased community involvement and volunteerism simply because of the great needs in communities around our country? Are little platoons serving neighbors around the country? Lexi, do you want to take a stab at that?
I will. I'll offer an answer. There are two ways to answer this. One's empirically, one's anecdotally. I think that empirically, we will be studying this era for years, maybe decades to come. It's just been so peculiar, so extraordinary in so many ways. But anecdotally, I have reported, this was part of my Novak fellowship, reporting on civic life at its best, which COVID-19 and the crisis it brought on, it tested us, and it revealed that the Tocquevillian, voluntary spirit of association is alive and well. And it's really, and we see this time and time again in American history in times of crisis, that when need is so great that no single government and no single policy or government policy or policy maker can just snap their fingers and pull a lever and make all the need go away. We see people stepping up. We see innovation. We see the business sector enjoying a lot of generosity. We see neighbors helping neighbors. We see people creating apps to deliver groceries and meals to elderly people in need. And so, and just tons and an incredible amount of outpouring of generosity and ingenuity that we have seen. So I cannot give any empirical answers, rather. I don't think anyone has that information at this point, but I can tell you anecdotally that I've been tracking this and I've written about it. You can find my series of columns on this at on USA Today's website, and that makes me hopeful. And I think the question is, and it's kind of interesting. We had a period of like a lot of solidarity right before the pandemic got politicized, kind of in the early days, and it kind of makes me wonder how we'll come out of this when we do have a vaccine. But I'm hopeful.
Richard, did you want to speak to that question?
I don't think I really have anything to add. Sorry about that. And I think Alexandra answered it. I agree with everything she just said, and I don't have any insights above and beyond that.
All right, and on to our next question. This attendee says, it seems that universities around the country are not encouraging bringing people together across various divides. Speakers are canceled and other things. If our universities are not encouraging our youth to have civil dialogue, it seems that it will be difficult going forward. What are your thoughts?
Go ahead, Richard, if you want to talk about your campus culture or otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult thing in that I think that civility is important, but then I worry sometimes that civility can be something that smothers, right? Civility can be something that deems certain voices. There was I'll maybe answer two questions at the same time here. There was a question that came by early on the sidebar that had to do with worries about who's included and who's excluded. And I guess one of the worries I have about civility and the focus on civility is that, at least historically, civility has been something that's been used to sort of screen out, whether explicitly or implicitly, certain voices as being uncivil or uncivilized. And so one wants to try to think about how one can appeal to civil discourse in a way that is inclusive, and a way that's inclusive across all kinds of different metrics, not just inclusive in some of the ways we think about in terms of gender and in terms of race and in terms of other kinds of traditional grounds of exclusion, but inclusive of all kinds of different political perspectives as well. One of the difficulties is, though, on campus, that when one tries to include certain views, there can be, I mean, I haven't firsthand experienced this, but I know other colleagues who've tried to invite speakers who might be deemed controversial, speakers on both the right and the left who might be deemed controversial. And then there's a certain amount of incivility that emerges, right, to shut down those voices and to foreclose the opportunity to have this kind of civil discourse. So I don't know. I mean, I think I am a strong defender of both the diversity of viewpoints and of the openness of views. And yet I do think that there might be some views that just go beyond the pale, and that some voices that are that maybe, I hesitate to say this, but not that certain voices should be shut down, but that including certain voices or perspectives in a university may generate more sound and fury than they actually generate civil dialogue. And I don't know how, I wouldn't want to police that. I wouldn't want to draw lines and say this particular perspective is in, that particular perspective is on the other side. But I think it is a balancing act that universities have to try to negotiate. I don't think that universities have done, as of late, a particularly good job of negotiating or policing that boundary. I think they've drawn it in a certain skewed direction. But I think at the margins, there really are certain kinds of conversations that are unproductive. Just like in a seminar within the classroom, not extracurricular, but within the classroom, you know, you want to try to have an open conversation, you want to have all different students sharing their viewpoints, but sometimes there are certain views where, as a professor, you have to, well, I don't know that that's going to take us in a direction that's really productive of civil dialogue, or more problems will come with you raising that issue than we're going to get productive ideas and productive exchanges out of it. So I think there probably is at the margins a limit. I just don't want to be the one to say where that limit is, and I disagree with how many universities are setting that limit in this day and age.
On to our next question. If Alexandra, if you're good.
Yeah.
All right. We have another attendee that asks, if one side repeatedly says no to civility in today's climate, while the other tries to embrace it outside of just our political issues, how do you then bridge the divide? To me, it seems the side that would try to civilly bridge the gap would result in their ideals being overwhelmed or drowned out.
It's a great question. And that exact question is why we find ourselves in this ever escalating political brinksmanship where, you know, one side, you know, does or says something that's, you know, a new low. It's breached all the norms of decency and democracy and goodness. And then the other side feels empowered to do something even more drastic, you know, and it just becomes this race to the bottom. And it's true. It's kind of like this classical philosophical question, like, can a good person be good in an unjust and evil world? But so at the level of our public discourse, so it's kind of this, there's this correlative cycle. There are citizens and the relationships we have with one another, and our public leaders and the relationships they have with other public leaders. And, you know, a lot of our frustration with civility today is at this level, at the level of, you know, civility or lack thereof between our public leaders. And I think So, and the civility conference in the 90s was one instance where our public leaders got together and said, we're going to take ownership of our role in this issue. And we are going to try and elevate the public discourse by being better and modeling better. And of course, that lasted only so long, as we know, because of the breakdown in the wake of the 97 conference and also just looking at the state of our public discourse today. So I'm kind of more over in this camp, like the camp of citizens, the role of citizens in elevating our public discourse. Like if we want more civility in our public discourse, then we elect politicians and public leaders that care and model the kind of values that we want to see more of.
Great. Let's try to get one more question in, Xander.
All right. From John Bosil. Do we need political parties to regain power to rein in rogue or possibly inept or outrageous candidates for elected office?
Go ahead, Richard.
You get that, Richard?
I didn't get all of the connective logic in the question. The political parties, do we need them? And then it had something to do with having either the rogue candidates or the bug or the feature, or?
Do we need political parties to regain power in order to rein in rogue or possibly inept or outrageous candidates for elected office?
So can stronger political parties help solve the problem of candidates that promote incivility, I guess?
So I'm of two minds there. One of my most influential professors when I was in graduate school, Wilson Carey McWilliams, was a dyed-in-the-wool defender of the importance of parties and party politics. And the argument he always made was that parties are in the best position to decide who good candidates will be because they know something about the character of these individuals. I mean, it's kind of an old Burkean argument, right? That what parties do, because they know the people involved, is they screen out and avoid people who are demagogues, who are rogues, right, who are trouble, or who are corrupt in some ways. You can rely upon the party to police and to screen out and to filter for things like corruption or things like extremism. And I guess I've always, maybe just because I admired him so much, I've always sort of bought into that argument because he made it so well. That being said, though, the argument is predicated on the assumption that parties actually do that, right? As opposed to parties perhaps becoming complacent, parties themselves perhaps being corrupt, parties simply running with or running the same candidates who are not responsive to the voters or responsive to changes in the electorate or changes in priorities. So I don't have, other than saying that there's something to the arguments on both sides, I don't have a strong view of what the empirics of that are, right? If you indeed believe that the DNC is non-responsive and you believe that the RNC is out of touch, then yeah, maybe you don't want parties, right? But on the other hand, if you think that the problem is these eccentric, crazy, radical rogue candidates coming along, then maybe you do want to rely more heavily and you want to do more to bolster the authority and the control that parties would exercise over, say, the primary process. So I think it depends, right? I don't think you can answer that in a categorical way.
Great, thanks. If we didn't get to your question tonight, and you really want it answered by Alexandra or Richard, shoot an email to michelle@tfas.org, michelle@tfas.org, and we can send it along to them and ask for a response. Let me ask the two of you if you want to have a final word on any of this tonight. Alexandra or Richard? We covered a lot of ground and I appreciate it.
We did. We covered 2,500 years of intellectual history and I think it was very impressive. And I hope that this is one of many conversations. These are incredibly important topics that are not going away anytime soon. And I'm grateful to each one of you, all 38 attendees that are still here for being here and being a part of this conversation, sharing your night with us. And I hope that we have more opportunities to do this again in the future. So thank you to Roger and the whole TFAS team as well for facilitating this and inviting Richard and I here.
Yes, likewise. Thank you, Roger and TFAS and Alexandra. It's been a real pleasure, and everyone for setting this up, and all of you for taking the time to join us tonight and ask these terrific questions. I guess my default value starting this off was to make the claim that maybe things are not as bad as we might think, but having seen the engagement, right, and the questions that are coming up, and the optimism and examples that people are sharing, I think I've been moved from not as bad as we might think to actually much better, and maybe even very heartening heartening and encouraging that there is this much interest, and that people, I think, I don't know where everyone's coming from or who many of these people are who are asking the questions, but I sense, right, a common desire to work, right, to try to cultivate these kinds of conversations and this kind of spirit in our political life. So it's very encouraging, and thank you so much for including me.
Well, thank you. As Professor Boyd sees in our classroom, our programs, bring students from the left, right, center, all over the spectrum together for a summer semester where they live, learn, and intern together. And I hope gain a respect for each other's viewpoints, for the differences that exist, as well as Alexandra said, the similarities we have as human beings and as Americans. So we hope that we promote that at TFAS. And thank you both for being with us tonight. If anyone who has participated tonight has a topic for a future event, send that topic along to michelle@tfas.org, and we'll be happy to try to put something together in the future. Alexandra Hudson. Alexandra, when do you anticipate your book coming out?
Hopefully very early 2022.
Good, wonderful. Well, we'll do another one of these programs when you're ready to talk about the book.
Great.
And Professor Boyd, thank you for all you do for us as well. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you, Xander, for moderating these questions. Everyone have a pleasant evening and a happy Thanksgiving.
Thanks all. Merry Christmas.